Have you ever wondered what hunger really felt like in the Middle Ages? Not the kind that comes before dinner, but the slow, patient hunger that lived beside you, followed you into the fields, and sat beside the hearth every night. For the medieval peasant, food was not a matter of taste or pleasure, it was a fragile negotiation with survival itself. Every crust of bread, every spoon of broth, was a small victory against the cold, against the endless work, and against time. Tonight, let's travel back to the quiet countryside of medieval England, where the smoke of peat fires curled through thatched roofs, and the smell of boiling barley and cabbage drifted through small timber huts. Here, meals were not feasts, they were memories of what might have been, and dreams of what might come tomorrow. For most peasants in the Middle Ages, food was simple, repetitive, and humble, and yet it carried the rhythm of life itself. The day began before dawn, with the bleating of animals, and the faint chill of mist lying low over the fields. In these early hours, the first meal was not a breakfast in the modern sense, but a kind of thin porridge, a watery mixture of oats or barley, boiled slowly over the fire, until it became something thick enough to silence the hunger for a few hours. Meat was rare, saved for feast days, or for the Lord's table. Most peasants lived on what the land gave them freely: grains, beans, onions, leeks, and whatever wild greens they could find along the edges of fields and forests. Their lives revolved around bread, but not the soft white bread of the wealthy. Theirs was coarse, dark, and heavy, made from rye or barley, dense with bits of unground grain that would dull a knife before it ever filled a stomach. Even so, this bread was sacred. It was the symbol of work made visible, the reward for every aching back and every field ploughed by hand. To waste it was unthinkable. Every crumb was eaten, every crust softened with broth or ale. The most common meal, and perhaps the most important, was pottage, a kind of thick soup that was both dinner and survival plan. It began with whatever the household had: a few turnips, a handful of peas, perhaps some cabbage leaves, and a sprinkle of barley. These were chopped, thrown into a single iron pot, and left to simmer over the fire for hours. The result was a stew that changed with the seasons, sometimes rich and thick in summer, when gardens offered beans and leeks, sometimes thin and grey in winter, when only roots and stored grains remained. Salt was precious. Spices were almost unknown, but the flavour, faint, smoky, earthy, was the taste of continuity. A single pot of pottage could be reheated for days, each time thickened with scraps of yesterday's bread, and stretched again with a little more water. Children grew up with this flavour. Old men ended their lives with it. It was in its quiet way the food of endurance, and the silent proof that even the poorest hearts could find a way to live through the harshest seasons. If there was one constant in a peasant's life, one thing that marked the rhythm of every day, every prayer, and every harvest, it was bread. But not the white, soft, perfumed bread that the nobles ate, baked from fine wheat sifted through silk and dusted with flour, so light it floated in the air like snow. No, for the peasant, bread was a dark and heavy companion, baked from barley, rye, or even oats when the wheat was too expensive to dream of. It was dense and solid, cut not with delicacy but with effort, its crust sometimes so thick and blackened from the smoke of a low fire that it needed to be soaked in broth before a tooth could manage it. This bread was often baked once a week, sometimes in a communal oven shared by several families, and sometimes right there at home, in a hearth that doubled as kitchen, heat source, and a kind of altar for survival. When the dough rose too little, or the flour was too coarse, no one complained. They were simply grateful that it had risen at all. It was common for mothers to slice off the thinnest pieces and soften them in the warm remains of pottage, letting their children eat first, a small, silent ritual of care repeated endlessly across centuries of poor villages and silent mornings. And yet, as humble as it was, this bread had meaning far beyond its taste. It was the physical proof of labour, of hours bent beneath the sun, of hands that sowed and reaped, threshed and milled, kneaded and baked. When a peasant broke his bread, he was breaking his work, his exhaustion, his time, and offering it back to his family. There was holiness in that gesture, not the kind that priests spoke of in stone churches, but a quieter holiness, born from effort and hunger, and the will to endure. Bread was rarely eaten alone. It was accompanied by ale, not the strong, intoxicating kind of drink that nobles poured into silver cups during their feasts, but a thin, weak brew, almost like a liquid bread itself. This small ale was made at home, often by the women of the house, who boiled water with malted barley, added herbs or yeast, and let it ferment just enough to keep it from spoiling. It was safer to drink than water, for the streams and wells were often tainted by the very animals that peasants tended, and so ale became the drink of daily life. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. Everyone did, because in that dull, cloudy liquid lay the simplest secret of medieval health survival through fermentation. When work in the fields was long and the sun was cruel, the peasants carried this ale with them in small wooden jugs. They drank it warm, tasting the faint bitterness of the grain, and the smoke from their hearths still clinging to the liquid. It filled the stomach just enough to quiet the hunger until evening, when the household gathered again around the fire, and the pot of pottage was stirred once more. Sometimes, if the year had been kind and the hens had laid enough eggs, or if a neighbour had bartered some cheese, the meal would be enriched with a few small luxuries, a lump of salted butter, a wedge of crumbly cheese made from sheep's milk, or even a slice of cured pork fat saved from a distant feast day. These moments were not taken for granted. They were small celebrations, whispered gratitude that for one night the hunger had loosened its grip. Yet there were also times, and many of them, when there was no barley left to grind, when the stores had run out, when the rain had drowned the fields and the harvest had failed. In those months, people turned to acorns ground into meal, or to bread made from peas, ferns and weeds, mixed with a little straw to make it last longer. It was bitter and hard, and it left a sour taste that stayed in the mouth for days, but it was still food, still something to fill the emptiness. And sometimes, even that was a miracle. The smell of such bread, half earth, half smoke, was the smell of survival. It clung to clothes, to hair, to every wooden beam of the cottage. To live in those times was to live surrounded by the smell of hunger, of fire, and of effort. Even the air itself carried the faint echo of work, of animals, of sweat, of wet soil, everything blending into a scent that no modern perfume could ever imitate, because it was the perfume of endurance, of human persistence. And when night came, and the last bowl was emptied, the peasant would sit quietly before the dying fire, listening to the faint crackle of embers. The body was tired, the hands rough and blistered, but there was comfort in knowing that somehow for another day they had eaten. The ache in the stomach had quieted. The children were asleep, and in the silence between one day and the next, the sound of the wind outside seemed almost like a lullaby, a promise that tomorrow, perhaps, the earth would still provide. There were seasons in the medieval year when food became not only scarce but sacred, when even the smallest meal was governed by the church calendar and the slow, patient turning of the earth itself. During Lent, or on any of the more than 100 fasting days scattered through the year, the rules of eating shifted. Meat disappeared entirely. Butter, milk, eggs, all forbidden. And so, the peasant, already living close to the edge of hunger, had to find new ways to fill the void left behind by these absences. In those weeks, the diet became one of vegetables and herbs, wild and domestic alike. What could be gathered from the fields, the hedgerows, or the forest became the centerpiece of every meal. Women and children walked the muddy paths at dawn, baskets on their hips, searching for nettles, dandelions and sorrel, humble weeds that when boiled together made a broth that smelled faintly of earth and spring rain. Sometimes they would add a few handfuls of barley or oats, stretching the meal into something closer to a stew, the steam rising from the pot carrying the scent of soil, smoke and green leaves. It was in these small acts, the gathering, the boiling, the sharing, that the peasants found a quiet dignity. Even the poorest among them could transform the wild gifts of the land into something nourishing, if not delicious. A handful of salt, when it was available, could turn a bitter broth into something almost comforting. And when salt was gone, they learned to live with bitterness, to taste it, accept it, and move on. In the depth of winter, when the fields slept under frost, and the forests offered nothing but dead branches and silence, the meals became slower, heavier, and more desperate. The hearth was everything, the heart of the home, the only defense against the cold. The pottage that simmered there was often the same pot used all year, its iron blackened, its rim lined with years of smoke and ash. Inside there might be a turnip or two, some dried peas, a handful of onions, or the last bits of grain from a sack that once fed the whole family. Sometimes, a bone, long stripped of meat, would be boiled again and again, each day giving up one more trace of its flavor until it was nothing but a pale memory of nourishment. And yet, people survived. They found ways to make the nothingness stretch, to make hunger bearable. Bread crusts were softened in ale, or roasted by the fire until they were just warm enough to pretend to be new again. Children chewed on roots or gnawed on pieces of dried bark, while their mothers whispered that spring was coming, that the green would return, and that soon there would be milk and cheese again. When the frost began to melt and the rivers thawed, the fields turned soft and alive once more. This was the season of foraging, a time when even the poorest family could find some small luxury in the wild. Fresh herbs appeared first: parsley, leeks, garlic, wild onions. Then came the berries, mushrooms, and honey. If the bees had survived the winter, there was an almost sacred joy in these discoveries. Not a feast, but the memory of one. The first taste of something fresh after months of grey-boiled food was enough to make a grown man close his eyes in silence, to feel gratitude, not as prayer, but as relief. And still, the rhythm of poverty returned, as it always did. By summer, the hunger of winter was forgotten, replaced by the exhaustion of work, the endless harvests, the long hours spent in the fields, the ache that settled deep in the spine. Meals were quick, eaten standing, bread dipped in ale, onions bitten raw, a piece of cheese, if one was lucky, a slice of cold pottage left over from the morning. There was no time to cook when the sun was high, and the scythe was heavy. At night, the cottage filled with the sounds of quiet eating, the scrape of wooden spoons on clay bowls, the crack of crusts breaking, the low hum of conversation barely louder than the wind. The air smelled of hay and sweat and faint smoke. In those moments, food was not about flavor, or pleasure, or even comfort. It was simply about life continuing, about getting through one more day, one more week, one more winter. To live as a medieval peasant was to live in negotiation with hunger, never entirely defeating it, never entirely giving in. Every meal was both a prayer and a gamble. Would there be enough grain to last until next harvest? Would the cows survive the frost? Would the miller take too much? Would God be merciful? And yet, through all this, the cold, the toil, the endless sameness, there was something beautiful in their endurance. They found small joys: the warmth of a loaf baked fresh from the communal oven, the sweetness of a stolen apple, the laughter that filled a house when the first ale of the season was ready. They lived without plenty, but not without meaning. And that perhaps was their greatest meal of all, the quiet satisfaction of having endured another day in a world where survival itself was an act of grace. Once or twice a year, perhaps on Christmas, or at Easter, or on the feast day of a local saint whose name was carved into the church door, the world of the peasant changed. For a brief and almost unbelievable moment, the monotony of grey porridge and bitter greens gave way to smells that seemed to come from another life entirely. The sizzling of meat, the sweetness of baked dough, the rich, heavy perfume of animal fat, mingling with smoke that curled toward the rafters. It began early, sometimes days before, when word spread through the village that the Lord would grant a feast, or that the church would bless the table after Mass. Women began to grind flour with hands already sore from the harvest, their palms turning white with dust. Men slaughtered pigs or chickens that had been fed slowly over the year, not livestock for profit, but companions of survival finally offered up to celebration. The air filled with the cries of animals, the clang of pots, the low hum of voices, the strange mixture of joy and guilt that came whenever plenty entered a poor man's house. And when the day arrived, everything changed. The same cottages that smelled all year of damp straw and boiled cabbage now smelled of roasted flesh and bread. Even the poorest family would find something special: a piece of meat traded for labor, a jug of stronger ale shared between neighbors, a candle lit not for prayer but for the beauty of its glow. Children would sit close to the hearth, wide-eyed, watching the meat turn slowly on its spit, the fat dripping into the flames with a sound like rain on dry ground. It was, for them, the sound of joy. The bread, for such a day, was different too. The coarse rye was mixed with a little white flour, perhaps bought from the miller or saved from the Lord's leftover stores. It baked golden instead of black, its crust softer, its smell sweeter, its taste like a memory of heaven. Some households flavored it with honey, or with dried fruit, if any remained from the last market, figs, currants, even a few crushed nuts if they could be afforded. When the loaf came from the oven, steaming and alive, people touched it reverently, almost afraid to cut it, as though it might vanish the moment it was divided. For once, the pottage was thick and rich, flavored with meat broth, leeks, herbs and salt, real salt, not the grey, gritty kind, but the fine white crystals traded from faraway coasts. It filled the small houses with warmth that felt deeper than heat, warmth that came from satisfaction, from fullness, from a temporary truce with the hunger that ruled most days. Mothers would smile quietly as their children ate, seeing their faces stained with grease and contentment, the rare sight of appetite truly ending before exhaustion did. Outside, after the meal, people would gather near the church or the common green. The men would drink, the women would sing, the children would chase each other through the cold grass, their laughter echoing through the wooden houses like birds freed from cages. For a few hours, perhaps for a day, there was no difference between lord and peasant, hunger and plenty, work and rest. The world, in its rare generosity, seemed balanced again. But even in the midst of joy, there lingered something quieter, a kind of melancholy that peasants knew too well. They ate slowly, almost fearfully, aware that the feast was a guest that would soon leave, and that tomorrow the pots would once again hold nothing but barley and cabbage. So they savoured every bite as though it were a story told only once in a lifetime. The fat from the meat would be carefully saved, melted down to flavour soups for the next week. The bones would be boiled until they turned hollow and pale, their essence drawn out like a secret that could not be wasted. In those small deliberate acts of preservation, there was philosophy, an understanding of impermanence. A medieval peasant knew, better than anyone, that joy was brief, that plenty was a visitor, and that survival was the only constant guest. And yet, they celebrated with full hearts, because to taste joy at all was proof that life still had colour. As night descended, the fire burned low. The ale jugs were empty, the plates wiped clean with crusts of bread, and the laughter had softened into silence. Outside, the stars hung heavy and cold, and a thin mist crept over the fields, wrapping everything in a quiet silver shroud. Inside, people slept soundly, bellies full, hearts light, their dreams sweet for the first time in months. Tomorrow, the hunger would return, the fields would call, and the long rhythm of labour would begin again. But tonight, in the stillness between feast and famine, the medieval peasant slept with the rare peace of knowing what it felt like to be full, truly, miraculously full, and to believe, even for a fleeting moment, that God had remembered them. In the medieval world, food was never merely food, it was a language spoken between the earth and the soul, between what could be seen and what could only be hoped for. Every loaf of bread, every pot of soup, every drop of ale carried not only the labour of the body, but the quiet faith of those who made it. And for the peasant, who had so little control over weather, harvest or fate, food became a kind of prayer that could be touched, tasted, and shared. The church, with its bells and blessings, had its own rhythm, but the peasant's rhythm was older, the rhythm of seasons, of soil, of hunger and relief. Each meal marked time not in minutes or hours, but in harvests and famine, in ploughing and rest, in birth and burial. To eat together was to remember that life, even in its harshest form, continued. And so, meals were more than nourishment. They were gatherings of spirit, even when no one spoke. When the bread was cut, it was often done with care, the sign of the cross traced over it before the knife touched the crust. Even the poorest man bowed his head for a moment before eating, whispering a prayer not for plenty, but for endurance. He did not ask for feasts, for the peasant knew that abundance could be as dangerous as drought. He asked only that the next meal might come, and that the earth would not forget him. In villages, the sharing of food was the foundation of trust. If a family's stores ran dry before spring, neighbours would lend from their sacks, not because they could afford to, but because they knew their turn would come next year. A village that did not share would starve together, but a village that shared would somehow survive. And so food became not only sustenance but a bond, a thread of survival stretched between households like the faint smoke that rose from every hearth and met above the rooftops, joining into a single sky. The church feasts too were not just about eating, they were about remembering. In an age when literacy was rare, bread and ale were the books everyone could read. Through them, people learned about sacrifice, patience and the rhythm of creation. The priest might speak of heaven, but the peasant tasted it, only when a loaf came warm from the fire, when the smell of barley filled the air, when the hunger in his chest eased just enough to let him breathe without pain. In those moments, he felt closer to God than he ever did in a cathedral. There were also meals eaten in silence, under darker skies. When plague came, or when war swept through the fields leaving only mud and ashes, people ate in fear. The sound of spoons scraping bowls became a kind of mourning song. And yet even then, food carried meaning. If a family had nothing but a single onion, or a cup of grain, they would boil it and divide it among themselves with the same solemnity, as if it were gold. No one took more than their share, for greed was a sin that hunger revealed quickly. There are records of peasants eating things that today would seem unthinkable: acorns ground into flour, nettles boiled until soft, bark shaved from trees and cooked into paste, even cats and dogs during the worst winters of the 14th century. And yet behind each desperate recipe lay not savagery but ingenuity, the eternal refusal to die quietly. The act of making something edible out of the inedible was itself an act of faith, a whispered declaration that the world, though cruel, could still be persuaded to give. Some monasteries opened their gates to the starving. Inside, the monks served thick lentil stews, flat barley cakes, and cheese hardened with salt, food that was simple but clean, food that reminded the hungry that not all hunger was punishment. The monasteries were not rich, they too lived from the land, but they understood that to feed a man was to keep a soul tethered to hope, and so for a few days, peasants who had walked barefoot for miles could rest their bones on straw mats and eat in silence under candlelight, surrounded by the sound of distant prayers echoing down the stone halls. Everywhere in medieval life, food and faith were inseparable, two sides of the same coin of endurance. To fast was to honor God, to eat was to thank Him. To plant was to trust Him, to harvest was to praise Him. And when famine came, the faithful did not curse, they knelt, whispering that the soil was still holy, even when it gave them nothing. Yet, beneath all this reverence, there was something deeply human, the simple joy of taste. Even in poverty, people found pleasure. A crust of bread charred just right, the sweetness of an apple stolen from the Lord's orchard, the rare crackle of meat fat over a fire. It was not indulgence, but gratitude, the kind of happiness that comes not from abundance, but from contrast. For when one lives close to hunger, even the smallest bite can feel like a feast. And in the evenings, after the bowls were emptied, and the embers glowed low, families sat in the stillness, their shadows dancing on the rough wooden walls. The children drifted into sleep with bellies that for tonight did not ache. The parents watched the fire and thought not of themselves, but of tomorrow's work, of sewing, of mending, of hoping. The silence was not empty, it was full of meaning, full of the quiet heartbeat of a world that refused to end. There came a stretch of years in the 14th century, when even the oldest villagers, the ones with faces like folded parchment, admitted they had never seen the land so silent. The clouds gathered for months without breaking, then poured for seasons without mercy. Grain rotted in the fields before it could ripen, hay blackened in the barns, sheep sank knee-deep in mud, and died where they stood. The smell of decay settled over Europe like a curtain that would not lift. At first people waited it out. They ate what had been stored, the last jars of salted beans, the last wheels of cheese, the last dried apples hung from rafters. When those were gone, they ground the seed meant for spring sowing, and baked it into flat, bitter loaves that tasted of despair. Then even the seed ran out. That was when imagination began to replace agriculture. Villagers turned to what the forests hid: beech mast, nettles, fern roots, moss scraped from stones, bark from elm trees, boiled until it softened. They mixed these with water, and a handful of ground straw to make what chroniclers later called hunger bread. It filled the belly but not the body. Men grew thin and yellow, their eyes too large for their faces. Children chewed on clumps of clay because the earth at least felt solid between their teeth. The old recipes vanished, replaced by improvisations whispered from cottage to cottage. A stew of snails thickened with acorn meal, a porridge of boiled thistles, a broth made from the bones of dead workhorses unearthed from shallow graves. Women learned the delicate art of disguise, adding ash or soot to darken the soup, pretending it was meat. They lied kindly, so that their children might believe it. In some parishes, the priests rang the church bells not for mass but for hunger. They walked the lanes barefoot, blessing what little was left: the rain-soaked barley, the stunted cabbage heads, the muddy water in the well. Faith became less about salvation, and more about endurance, a long conversation with silence. Then came the great famine of 1315, 1317, and with it, the sound of entire villages falling quiet. The rich sealed their storehouses, the poor gathered outside the gates, holding bowls like offerings. When no food came, they drifted away, whole families disappearing into the woods, chasing rumors of grain a county away. Many never returned. There are letters from monks, describing fields where the soil was turned, not for planting, but for burying. They speak of men who traded their last cloak for a loaf, of women who sold themselves for a bowl of oats, of children left at monastery doors with notes pinned to their rags. Feed him, pray for us. Yet, even in those years, the stubborn rituals of eating did not vanish. At sunset, whatever could be found was placed on the hearth, perhaps a pot of nettle soup so thin it barely steamed. People sat together, backs touching, hands cupped around wooden bowls. They said grace over nothing, because the act of saying it meant they still believed in tomorrow. When at last the rain stopped and the fields dried, the first green shoots were greeted like miracles. The peasants walked among them barefoot, whispering to the seedlings as if to children returned from the dead. They promised to waste nothing ever again, and for generations afterward, the memory of that hunger lived inside every meal, a shadow behind each crust of bread, a quiet reminder that survival was never guaranteed but always earned. When the skies finally cleared and the first real harvests returned, the memory of famine lingered in every household like a ghost that refused to leave. The peasants had learned too well how fragile abundance could be, and so they began to cook differently, quietly, cleverly, with an attention born of loss. Every scrap was reconsidered, every peel and stalk turned into something useful. Waste became a kind of sin, thrift a form of worship. They learned that flavor could live in the smallest places. A handful of herbs, parsley, sage, garlic leaves, marjoram, could make a pot of grain taste like a banquet. The women who gathered them knew exactly where the wild mint grew strongest along the riverbank, or which slope kept its thyme dry even in rain. They crushed the leaves between rough palms, releasing a smell so sharp and green, it could lift a room full of tired people into silence for a heartbeat. Salt, still precious, was rationed grain by grain. Those who lived near coasts traded baskets of dried peas or smoked fish for it. In inland villages, cooks turned to sourness instead, adding a drop of vinegar, a spoon of curdled milk, or the sharp juice of unripe apples to awaken the dull grains that filled most meals. What had once been the food of desperation became, slowly, the food of ingenuity. It was during these years that the smokehouses multiplied. The same fear that once drove them to eat bark, now taught them to preserve what they had. Meat and cheese were hung in the rafters above the fire, turning golden brown and fragrant over days of slow curing. The smell of smoke, once the scent of mere survival, became the smell of safety, of a winter already planned for. Pottage itself changed. Instead of being a single endless stew, it became an art of balance. Barley thickened with peas, flavored with onions, sometimes brightened with a spoon of mustard seed, or crushed dill. The people who had once eaten in silence began, at last, to take pride in the subtlety of what they created. Visitors from monasteries wrote of country stews with many tastes, of bread baked on hot stones and brushed with garlic oil, of cheeses wrapped in herbs so their edges turned green with flavor. Even the poorest villages began to develop signature foods, small, local miracles that reflected both landscape and memory. In some places, they made a thin gruel of oats and leeks that steamed pale and sweet on cold mornings. In others, they baked onion pies in clay pots buried beneath embers. River settlements mixed crushed barley with fish heads to make thick soups that shimmered with oil. None of it was luxury, yet each dish carried the same quiet triumph. We have survived, and we will eat again. Meals became longer, more social. The table, often no more than a plank balanced on barrels, was now a place where stories were traded as eagerly as bread. People spoke of the famine in lowered voices, like veterans recalling a war, and the children listened wide-eyed, learning gratitude spoon by spoon. Even the laughter that returned to these meals had a new weight. It was laughter that remembered. And over time these modest innovations became tradition. The poor had invented a cuisine built not on wealth but on attention. The careful layering of herbs, the saving of broth, the smoking of cheese, the patient boiling of lentils, until they turned creamy and gold. It was food meant not to impress, but to last, to nourish body and memory alike. The nobles, curious and ever hungry for novelty, began to copy what they saw in the cottages. In the great manors, cooks experimented with peasant sauces, those sharp herb mixtures and vinegars that cut through heavy meats. They called it refinement, never admitting that their inspiration came from hunger. Yet the essence remained the same. the wisdom of people who had learned to find abundance inside scarcity. So by the late Middle Ages, the peasant's table born of disaster had become the quiet root of European cooking. Every loaf baked with saved yeast, every soup stretched one more day, every smoked fish hanging in a cottage doorway carried the memory of those terrible years when flavor itself was an act of hope. By the late Middle Ages, every village had begun to pulse around its hearths, the smoky, glowing centers of life where food, warmth, and memory intertwined. In a world without clocks or calendars for most, the fire was the measure of time. When it was bright, the day had meaning. When it dimmed, night reclaimed everything. Around it, the slow choreography of medieval domestic life unfolded, most often guided by the hands of women who knew the difference between waste and wisdom better than any priest or lord ever could. For it was the women who carried the taste of the village. They were the keepers of yeast, saving a small lump of dough from each baking to birth the next loaf. They were the brewers, stirring barley and herbs in great wooden tubs, learning by instinct when the mixture had come alive. They gathered berries and greens, not by season but by scent, knowing when the nettles were soft enough to boil, or when wild garlic could perfume a whole meal. They cured meat with handfuls of salt and hung fish by the chimney, until it dried to paper, its edges curled and fragrant. These were not recipes. They were rituals, learned by watching, repeated without words. When a girl came of age, she inherited her mother's pots, not because they were valuable, but because they remembered. Every crack in the clay, every blackened rim held the ghost of meals cooked and shared, of winters survived. In a time when books were rare, cooking was the true inheritance. Knowledge passed through scent, touch, and repetition. Inside the peasant home, there was no kitchen, as we imagine it today. The same room that held the beds, also held the fire, the table, and the food. Smoke stained everything, rafters, walls, even the cradle of the youngest child. Yet that same smoke was what preserved the cheese above the beams, and kept the mice away from the barley sacks. The hearth was alive, hissing, cracking, whispering. Its breath was the sound of continuity. In the evenings, after the day's labor in the fields, people would gather, neighbors, family, travelers, who had nowhere else to go. They sat on stools, or low benches, the smell of soil still clinging to their clothes, and shared what they had. A bowl of pottage was passed hand to hand, spoons, dipping in silence. The heat of the fire painted everyone in shades of amber and gold. The room might be small, but it contained the entire world they needed: food, warmth, and each other. Over time, these nightly gatherings became more than habit. They became social glue, binding the village through repetition. News spread not through letters, but through bowls, one woman telling of a birth, another of a death, a man recounting the weather, or the Lord's new tax. Laughter and grief mixed freely, rising with the steam of the meal. Even disputes softened when shared beside a fire. A full belly made peace easier. The women who ruled the hearths also became quiet historians. They knew who had enough to eat, and who did not. They remembered which child had grown pale in winter, and which family had no salt left by February. In times of famine, they organized quiet exchanges, a jug of ale for a loaf, a handful of beans for a piece of butter. It was an invisible economy of mercy, one that the tax collectors could never measure. They also turned preservation into an art. Earthen jars filled with dried beans were sealed with wax and buried beneath the floor to stay cool. Cabbages were packed with vinegar and herbs, transforming into early forms of sauerkraut that would last through the frost. Fish were smoked until they looked like strips of polished leather but tasted of the sea even months later. This was not luxury, it was foresight, the quiet genius of those who refused to let hunger return uninvited. And as these domestic rhythms deepened, the hearth became something more than practical. It became spiritual. Before the evening meal, it was common to cross oneself, not toward a church, but toward the fire. The flame, small and steady, was treated with the same reverence as a candle on an altar. It was, in a sense, the poor man's chapel, a place where prayer took the form of boiling water, of turning grain into bread, of transforming the raw into the livable. In the dim light, as shadows lengthened on the walls, the peasants spoke softly. They told stories to the children, not grand tales of kings, but local ones of a pig that escaped the butcher, of a saint who blessed the barley, of a grandmother who once fed a whole family with a single cabbage. The stories were always about food, because food was the shape of life itself. And as the flames flickered low, and the bowls emptied, the only sound left was the soft breath of sleeping children, and the slow crackle of the fire, a reminder that for tonight, the world had given enough. Once each week, or once each fortnight when the roads were dry enough to walk, the villagers emptied into the winding lanes that led toward the market town. It was not just a place of trade, it was the only space where a peasant could feel, for a few hours, the pulse of the wider world. Men shouldered baskets filled with eggs or onions, women carried clay jars of ale, bundles of herbs, small wheels of cheese wrapped in linen. The old led donkeys. The young ran ahead, barefoot and laughing, tasting the rare thrill of going somewhere that smelled of everything at once. People, spice, smoke, and chance. As they neared the square, the air changed. It was thick with noise and scent. The clatter of iron pots on wooden tables, the bleating of goats, the hiss of roasting meat. Everywhere there was motion, smoke rising from cooking fires, crows circling overhead, dogs darting under carts for scraps. To a villager used to the quiet rhythm of fields and bells, the market felt like a miracle of chaos. There were the butchers, sleeves rolled high, their stalls dripping with cuts of salted pork and strings of sausages that swung gently in the breeze. The fishmongers, shouting over one another, laid out eels, river trout, and dried herring still shining faintly in the morning sun. Nearby, the cheesewomen sat behind baskets that smelled of grass and salt, their cheeses marked by fingerprints and pressed herbs, humble signatures of the maker, and beyond them, a chaos of colors, barrels of honey, piles of apples, carrots caked in soil, cloth bundles of oats, garlic braided into ropes like jewelry for the poor. The market was not only about what could be bought, but about what could be seen. Peasants who lived all year, surrounded by sameness, came to marvel at the strange, a peddler selling nutmeg and cinnamon, from lands they had never heard of, a monk offering miracle vinegar for fevers, a traveller roasting chestnuts while singing a song in a tongue no one understood. To walk among these sights was to feel, briefly, rich, and while some traded seriously, weighing grain on crooked scales, bartering eggs for a pinch of salt, others came simply to eat what they could not cook at home. At one corner of the square, a man might be roasting a piglet on a spit, turning it slowly, its fat dripping onto the fire with a hiss that seemed to speak directly to the stomach. At another, women sold bowls of hot pottage, thickened with peas, the steam rising into the chill air like a small mercy. There were sweet buns glazed with honey, cups of warm ale spiced with herbs, and flat breads sprinkled with salt that crackled as they cooled. For many, this was the only time in the year when food tasted of pleasure rather than duty. It was here, among the noise and laughter, that one could afford a treat. A sliver of roasted meat, a bit of cheese too rich for daily life, a bite of apple tart still warm from the oven of a baker, whose hands smelled of ash and sugar. People ate standing, shoulder to shoulder, the smell of smoke in their hair, the joy of fullness in their throats. It was a rare kind of happiness, the kind that cost only a coin, but lingered for weeks in memory. The market was also a place of news, a living newspaper made of gossip and grain. You could hear about distant wars, about a new tax decreed by a lord, about a neighboring village struck by plague, or about a marriage that promised better harvests. But beneath all that there were quieter exchanges, recipes whispered between women, seeds traded in secret, advice about storing onions, or keeping cheese through the frost. Knowledge traveled with breadcrumbs, wisdom hid inside sacks of flour. As the day waned, people began the long walk home, baskets lighter, but hearts heavier with the coming chores. The smell of market day clung to them, roasted fat, smoke, and the faint sweetness of spilled ale drying on the road. Children fell asleep on their parents' shoulders, crumbs on their lips. The setting sun turned the sky the color of warm bread crust, and for a brief moment, the world seemed gentle again. At home they would unpack their treasures, a small bundle of salt, a strip of dried meat, a piece of fruit saved for Sunday. They would sit by the hearth, dividing the day's spoils, reliving every smell and sound in tired voices. And as the night settled, the market became memory, a place of abundance that lived on in stories, until the next time the road called them back. Travel in the Middle Ages was not for the impatient, nor for the well-fed. Roads were uncertain things, ruts of mud in spring, rivers of dust in summer, ribbons of ice in winter, and yet, whether pilgrim or merchant, messenger or wandering monk, everyone who stepped beyond the boundary of their own village carried the same fragile hope that what they had packed in their satchel would last long enough to bring them home again. The food of the road was never elaborate. It had to endure the miles, the weather, and the absence of fire. So travelers packed bread baked until hard as wood, loaves that could be soaked in ale or rainwater when teeth could no longer manage them. They carried cheese smoked or salted to survive the heat, and slabs of cured pork or dried fish tied with string and wrapped in cloth. A good piece of bacon was as valuable as a map. Those who could afford it filled small leather flasks with ale, the weak, sour kind that quenched thirst and masked the taste of stale food. Others relied on water from streams, blessing it before drinking, or steeping it with herbs to ward off illness. The wise carried onions or garlic, not for flavor but for protection. It was said they kept away sickness and evil spirits alike. For sweetness, there were apples, nuts, or small bundles of dried berries gathered the previous summer. Pilgrims tied them to their belts like charms, small reminders of the gardens they had left behind. And sometimes, when the road grew lonely and the wind too sharp, they would untie one, not because they were hungry, but because the taste of home was worth more than any coin. Along the great routes, toward Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, the smell of food and humanity drifted like incense. At dawn, smoke from roadside fires mixed with the scent of leather, sweat, and damp wool. Pilgrims sat in circles, warming thin stews made from whatever could be bought or begged, a handful of peas, a slice of bread, a strip of salted meat boiled soft again. They ate from shared pots, wooden spoons clicking softly, their faces glowing in the firelight. Strangers became companions over these humble meals. Hunger was a common language. The sound of eating was part of the road itself. The crack of crusts, the glug of ale, the faint hum of prayers murmured before swallowing. And though the food was poor, the company was rich. There were men who had never left their village until that pilgrimage, now sitting beside sailors, soldiers, and monks, all of them chewing the same tough bread, all of them equal before hunger. The road also taught patience. Food had to be rationed not by appetite, but by distance. A loaf of bread was divided in half, then quarters, then eighths, as the miles stretched on. Some travelers marked the crusts with knife scratches, one for each day remaining, eating their hope bite by bite. But there were also small blessings. In some villages, the sight of weary travelers stirred compassion. Women would step from their doorways with bowls of warm porridge, hard-boiled eggs, or thin broth flavored with leeks. Sometimes, a jug of ale was passed freely, and for a moment the road became less cruel. At monasteries too, there were tables always ready, simple benches beneath vaulted ceilings where silence ruled, and the only sound was the gentle clatter of wooden spoons. The monks served bread, beans and cheese, their own form of prayer written in nourishment. Many travelers wept as they ate, not from sadness, but from the shock of being cared for. For merchants, the rhythm of eating became as methodical as trade itself. They counted their provisions like coins, 1 loaf for 3 days, 1 piece of cheese for 2, 1 flask of ale per league. They learned to eat slowly, to chew the silence, to savor even the taste of dust when nothing else remained. At night they slept beside their horses, wrapping food in cloth and hanging it from branches to keep it safe from rats. The smell of smoked meat mixed with that of wet leather and dew, the scent of the road itself. And yet, for all its hardship, there was a strange beauty to eating under an open sky. When the sun set behind the fields and the first stars appeared, the world seemed vast and forgiving. A crust of bread eaten beside a stream could taste better than a feast in a lord's hall, because it was earned, because it belonged to no one but the traveller and the earth that gave it. Sometimes, they met other wanderers, shepherds driving their flocks, tinkerers mending pots, pilgrims returning home. They would share what little they had, one giving a piece of bread, another offering a sip of ale, and there, beneath the evening light, the exchange felt almost holy. For in the Middle Ages, generosity was not a luxury, it was survival shared. By the time the traveller reached home, his satchel would be nearly empty. A few crumbs, a smell of smoke, perhaps a single apple untouched. He would set it down by the hearth, sit before the fire, and feel the old world closing around him again. And as he bit into that last apple, the taste was no longer of fruit, but of distance, of everything he had seen, of every kindness and every hunger that had shaped him along the way. If the peasant's meal was a struggle with the soil, the monk's meal was a conversation with the soul. In monasteries scattered across the green folds of medieval Europe, from the damp valleys of England to the sunlit cloisters of Provence, food was both nourishment and discipline, both daily necessity and daily prayer. Here, eating was not about pleasure, but about order, an act to remind the body of its place beneath the spirit. Each day began in darkness. Long before dawn, the bell rang through the cloister, echoing off cold stone walls. The monks rose silently from their straw pallets, faces pale in the flicker of candles, and gathered for the first prayers of the day. Only after hours of chanting and labor did they eat, a small, humble breakfast of bread and ale, sometimes accompanied by a few beans or a slice of cold cheese. The bread was coarse, the ale weak, the meal brief. No words were spoken, for speech belonged to the world outside, and the refectory was not the world. It was a place between body and heaven. When the bell rang again for the main meal, usually near midday, the monks filed in 2 by 2, their sandals whispering against the stone floor. The room was long and narrow, with wooden tables stretching beneath arched ceilings that smelled faintly of wax, herbs and damp parchment. Sunlight poured through narrow windows, turning the dust in the air into drifting gold. Each monk stood behind his seat until the abbot gave a signal. Then they bowed their heads and began the meal in absolute silence. Food was simple, always enough to sustain, never enough to tempt. Bowls of lentil soup thickened with onions, boiled cabbage, bread baked from rye, and a cup of watered ale. On feast days perhaps fish, or a little butter. Meat was forbidden except in illness. The Benedictine rule said, "Let all things be done in moderation," and so, moderation became their flavor. While the monks ate, one of them read aloud from a book, the scriptures, the lives of saints, or the sermons of the fathers. His voice, steady and slow, filled the refectory like the hum of bees in a summer field. The words mingled with the sound of spoons against bowls, creating a rhythm both earthly and divine. Each bite was a meditation, each swallow a reminder of gratitude. To eat in silence was to let the body remember its dependence on God, on nature, on the work of many unseen hands. Their food came entirely from the land around them, for monasteries were self-sustaining worlds. They grew barley and wheat in their fields, tended orchards heavy with apples and pears, kept bees for honey, and raised cows for milk and cheese. The monks were not rich, but they were skilled. Their gardens were known across Europe for their order and abundance. Every herb had its place: sage for digestion, parsley for cleansing, thyme for the lungs, mint for the breath. To plant was to pray, to harvest was to praise. In the cellar, great barrels of ale and wine rested in the cool dark. The brewing of ale was almost as sacred as the brewing of thought. Monks perfected the balance between grain and water, learning how to coax life from fermentation, a quiet alchemy that would one day become an art across all of Europe. Each sip was measured, never indulgent. Even in drink, they sought restraint. After the meal, they rose in unison. The bowls were washed in silence. The leftovers, if any, were given to the poor at the monastery gate. Then the refectory returned to stillness, the smell of bread and smoke lingering in the air like a fading hymn. At night, when the world outside slept and the stars hung low over the cloister garden, a faint warmth still glowed from the kitchen hearth. Sometimes, an old brother would sit there alone, watching the embers burn down. He would stir a pot of herbal broth, meant for the sick or the weary, and in that quiet labor he found his own prayer. To feed others was to serve God, to waste nothing was to honor creation. And so, within those walls, food became more than sustenance. It became theology written in vegetables and fire. Every crumb saved, every pot scrubbed, every cup shared was an echo of the divine order they sought to live by. Their hunger was not for fullness, but for balance, not for delight, but for peace. It was said that if you stood outside a monastery at noon, when the meal began, you could smell holiness itself. The soft steam of lentils, the faint sweetness of ale, the smoke of bread rising into the chill air, a perfume made of humility. In the same centuries when peasants scraped their bowls clean and monks weighed each mouthful as a prayer, there were halls, vast, echoing, gold-lit, where food was not a necessity but a spectacle. To step into the great hall of a noble house was to enter another world entirely, one where hunger had been turned into theatre, and abundance had become a language of power. At the upper end of the hall, beneath a canopy of painted beams, the lord and lady sat at a table raised on a dais, so that all might look upward when they spoke or ate. Before them spread a landscape of silver dishes, tall candles, and embroidered cloths heavy with grease and colour. The air was alive with music and smoke, with the smell of roasting meat so thick it clung to hair and cloth. Servants moved in quiet procession, carrying trays as wide as shields, roasted swans, peacocks with their feathers stitched back onto their cooked bodies, pies shaped like castles, and jellies trembling like glass. For the nobles, food was hierarchy made visible. Each course displayed their reach: spices from the east, sugar from Cyprus, almonds from Spain, oranges from Sicily. To eat exotically was to declare one's importance. And yet, even amid this wealth, the same truth persisted. Nothing was certain. A poor harvest could still make the salt dear, the wheat thin, the animals diseased. Luxury was a fragile illusion, held together by trade routes and servants' backs. The servants, meanwhile, lived in the scent of other people's hunger. They carried platters they would never taste, carved meats whose juices ran down their wrists. When the lords laughed and music rose, they slipped quietly to the kitchen to gnaw on bones, scrape sauce from pans or gather crumbs in their aprons. What they saved went into small bundles of cloth, hidden under benches or behind barrels, to be taken home after the feast. There in the dark cottages beyond the manor walls, these stolen leftovers became miracles. Bits of venison mixed into barley soup, a sliver of cheese shared among children, a drop of spiced wine sipped like medicine. The kitchens of the wealthy were their own kingdoms, hot, frantic, and strangely creative. Fires burned day and night. Spits turned constantly, creaking like tired animals. Cooks shouted orders in a dozen dialects, their faces slick with sweat, their fingers scarred from knives and boiling fat. They were craftsmen of illusion, painting peacocks in gold leaf, shaping pastry into towers, turning a simple egg into a nobleman's amusement. Theirs was the art of transformation, the same alchemy peasants practiced with nettles, but gilded, exaggerated, theatrical. And yet, even here, beneath the velvet and silver, the old logic of hunger persisted. The richest meal was still, in essence, a struggle against decay. Meat had to be salted, wine soured easily, fish spoiled in a day. Cooks fought time with spice and vinegar, masking the taste of rot beneath cinnamon and cloves. Luxury was not purity, it was clever disguise. The contrasts were impossible to ignore. In the villages beyond the castle gate, a family might live a month on the crumbs from one night's feast. At the manor, dogs were fed on meat pies, and the lord's hawks dined better than his tenants. Yet the same wind blew through both worlds, carrying the smell of bread from hearth to hall. At dusk, when torches were lit in the great hall, and fires burned low in the cottages, both rich and poor paused for a moment before eating. They crossed themselves in the same way. They bowed their heads. And though one ate swan and the other cabbage, both whispered the same prayer: "Give us this day our daily bread." But even among nobles, food was fleeting. A feast could fade into silence as quickly as it had begun. By morning the tables were cleared, the rushes on the floor swept away, the platters washed. What remained was only the scent, roast fat and spice, hanging in the air like a ghost. Servants yawned, scullions slept beside dying fires, and the house exhaled its fullness back into emptiness. And outside on the cold road, a peasant might wake and smell that ghost of richness drifting from the manor kitchens. He would pause, lift his head toward the wind, and smile faintly, not in envy, but in understanding, because even if his meal was nothing but bread and barley, he knew something the lords had forgotten, that the sweetness of food came not from sugar or spice, but from hunger itself, the deep, patient hunger that made every crumb a kind of grace. When war came to the Middle Ages, and it always came, the smell of iron soon drowned the smell of bread. Armies did not march on glory, they marched on whatever they could chew. Behind the banners, behind the prayers and horns, and clashing armor, there was always the same grim chorus, the creak of wagons loaded with barrels of ale, sacks of flour, wheels of cheese, hard as stone, and salted meat already turning grey at the edges. The logistics of hunger were as important as any sword. Soldiers lived on rations of endurance, not pleasure. A man's daily portion might be a rough loaf of barley bread, a handful of peas, a few strips of salted beef or pork boiled until it lost its color, and a cup of weak ale to wash it down. When the food ran out, they gnawed on leather straps or softened old bread by dipping it into river water. Sometimes, when no food arrived for days, they ground acorns or horse oats into dust and mixed it with lard to form a paste that could be fried on a shield heated over coals. They called it war bread. It was half food, half defiance. The camp kitchens were simple and brutal. Large iron pots, blackened by years of smoke, sat atop fires that burned all night. In them, soldiers boiled whatever they could find: bones, onions, herbs stolen from fields, scraps of salted pork, even the carcasses of horses fallen in battle. They stirred the mixture with their spears, laughing bitterly, saying it all tasted the same in the end, of smoke, sweat, and fear. Meat, when they had it, was salted so heavily it burned the tongue. The salt preserved life as much as it destroyed flavor. Those lucky enough to serve under a rich lord might eat better, roasted mutton, bread baked by camp followers, ale brewed on the march. But most lived from hand to mouth, sleeping with their provisions tied to their belts, lest hunger make thieves of friends. The noise of an army at mealtime was strange. Part animal, part prayer. The clang of spoons against metal bowls, the hiss of fat dripping onto fire, the low rumble of men eating without words. Hunger made silence sacred. They ate fast, hunched over their bowls, aware that at any moment the horn could sound, the sky could fill with arrows, and the next meal might be their last dot. In long campaigns, food became a form of currency. A loaf of bread could buy a knife, or a favor, or a man's loyalty. A sip of wine before battle was worth more than gold. Men who had marched together for months could fall to blows over a crust left unattended. Officers who controlled the rations wielded power more absolute than the sword. And yet, amid the filth and fear, there were rituals that persisted, remnants of the world they'd left behind. Before eating, some soldiers would still cross themselves, whispering a small blessing over their black bread. Others, too weary for words, would lift their bowls to the sky and murmur, "For home." The act of eating became a way to remember the reason for fighting: a wife, a child, a farm waiting far beyond the noise. When battle ended, and the field fell silent, the victors scavenged not only weapons but food. They looted the enemy's wagons, devoured what they found: biscuits, dried fruit, ale still frothing in barrels. It was a terrible feast, eaten among the dead. Chroniclers wrote that after great battles, the smell of cooking mingled with the smell of blood and smoke, until one could not tell where life ended and hunger began. For the wounded who survived, the first bowl of broth brought by camp followers or monks felt like a sacrament, made of bones and herbs. It was thin, almost clear, yet men wept when they drank it. It was warmth after cold, taste after terror. It reminded them they were still human. The long wars left their mark on kitchens too, in villages where armies had passed. People learned to cook with less, to hide food in walls, to stretch a pot of stew for days, to flavor water with hope. Out of violence grew caution, and out of caution, thrift. The recipes that survived those years, soups of beans, bread soaked in broth, meat stewed until tender, were born not of plenty, but of war's cruel arithmetic. How to make a little last, how to make hunger patient. At night, when the fires burned low, and the camp fell quiet, soldiers sometimes shared their last crust with each other. The stars above were cold, the earth below hard, but in that moment, chewing in silence, they belonged again to the same fragile brotherhood as every peasant and monk and noble who had ever raised food to their lips. A brotherhood bound not by class, but by the small eternal prayer hidden in every bite. May there be enough for tomorrow.